following an accident. They are open, but a car's now broken down at junction 1B, which is adding to those delays. Lambeth Bridge stays closed southbound. That's for the emergency repair works. And there's been an accident on the A2 westbound at Bexley, and that's extremely busy on the approach. On the trains, London Overground services can't run between Gospel Oak and Upper Holloway, and that's all down to that track problem.
LBC. Nick Ferrari now. 0345 6060 973 LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
10 minutes before 8 is the time, and it's fair to say a lot of people have been calling for this for some time, for some form of restriction on international arrivals. It's very easy, of course, for people like me sitting in studios who's never run a railway to actually say that, but what is the reality of taking those decisions? To Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, who joins me now, and I understand restrictions are coming in, Secretary of State. How will they work and when? Good morning to you.
Morning. Yeah, well, this is an addition to, rather than instead of, the much tougher thing we're already doing, which is, of course, quarantine, which requires everybody to stay in one place after they get here for 10 days, or they can make that 5 days if they take a test and release after 5 days. What we're saying in addition to that, though, is before you come here, up to 72 hours before, you must have taken a test, a recognised test, as a condition, if you like, of travel. You won't be able to get on that train, that plane, or that ferry to come to the country unless you've had the test.
What is a recognised test, Secretary of State?
Well, it's a test that Public Health England and others will have specified. So this is to do with what they call the sensitivity and the specificity of the test, the accuracy, essentially, of the test. And it has to be up to a very high standard, and those are the only tests you'll be able to take. But it should be said, it doesn't matter if the test is 100% accurate. simply getting a test before you come here is not a way to know that you are coronavirus free. It simply shows that you're not displaying the coronavirus tracers, the markers, at the moment that you take that test. So that's why it's an additional level, and it's why, by the way, this isn't the first thing that we've done. Well, the first thing we did, of course, way back last year was to introduce the quarantine itself, which in itself is a much more powerful tool than simply testing.
Okay, so a listener now listening in, I don't know, the Maldives or Morocco, how does he or she know that it will be one that would be accepted by border force authorities in the United Kingdom?
Very simple. When this comes in next week, gov.uk, as ever, will be the place to go, /coronavirus, but you'll find it if you go to gov.uk. And we'll have a list of the providers and the tests that they can use, and to get into a bit of technical detail.
So it'd be like brand names, will it, Mr. Shapps? It'd be like, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's, Waitrose, or whatever it will be, but that's effectively what they need to look for.
It's almost like that. If you go there at the moment, you'll see that there's this scheme which is called Test to Release. That's where, when you've already got back here from abroad, and after 5 days, you're eligible to take a test to release yourself from the second half of that quarantine, that self-isolation. And if you go to gov.uk, you'll already find the list of providers who have the right standard of test to be able to provide that. The same abroad. So you'll be able to have a look, and if you say you're in France or something, you'll be able to have a look at the gov.uk site and be clearly provided with a list of the different tests that would be applicable for somebody who's in that particular location. And
when does it become applicable? When does this kick in from?
So it will be next week. What
day, Secretary of State?
Likely on Wednesday or Thursday next week.
Why so long, Mr. Shapps?
Well, as I say, the thing to remember is...
They closed the schools within 24 hours, Secretary of State. We might do our borders in about 7 days.
No, it's not that. You see, you're misunderstanding something right at the beginning. Let me explain why. The most important thing is that people quarantine. That is the only thing which guarantees that when you come back from somewhere, you're not spreading the disease somewhere else. The addition of this test is to try to deal with just the bit where people are on the plane and potentially infect somebody else on that plane. So it's one additional slice to it. If we don't bring, you've got to announce these things some point, and then you've got to bring them in. If we don't provide any notice in between, Nick, what we'll get is a load of Brits stuck abroad, and we'll have a repatriation crisis. So you will excuse us for just needing to get the pieces in place to be able to do that properly.
And the sturdy body of men and women who run our border force will let's just say that I've come back from France, to use your example. Will I have to present then a document to him or her as I gain access back to this country?
So actually the access, if you like, will be on your rite of passage. So the airline or the train or the ferry is where you'll need to present this documentation to show that you've had that coronavirus test. So you can't get on the means of transport unless you've had the test.
So something like a ferry, then, I won't be able to get on P&O or Sea-Link or whoever else operate them unless I've been able to fill my booking and show that I've had a test that's been acknowledged by Her Majesty's government. Is that what we're saying?
Correct. And actually, most people won't have been travelling. And, of course, right now we're telling people not to travel. And there are relatively few Brits abroad for this reason.
Well, you say that, Secretary. I'm thinking of hauliers. Are they going to be exempted? Because there's a lot of our men and women driving trucks, of course.
So hauliers will be exempt from this, as will sort of air crew, border workers. People who travel backwards and forwards all day long as part of their job will be excluded. But there'll be relatively few exclusions from this. But you already have to fill in a passenger locator form by law. That's so that we can do the track and trace if there is a problem down the line. And this is, I'm afraid, something else that you will need to do. We don't want to keep any of this in place, though, Nick. I'm very, very keen to sort of scrap the whole system as soon as we can. And obviously, the vaccine is the route out of it. And we've got what is it, 1.5 million people who've already had the first jab in their arms now, and we're pumping that up to hundreds of thousands a day from next week, with over 1,000 GP-led locations to get it. And it's worth knowing for listeners, we've now given more Brits the jab than the whole of the rest of Europe put together. So we are absolutely accelerating that programme And that's the way to get out of this. We want vaccines and to make travel and every other part of life safe again.
That's quite interesting. This is something that, and I can understand because you'll probably be a libertarian at heart. This is something that you want to essentially scrap as soon as you can. Why put it in place then? What has happened in the preceding weeks or months that you and your colleagues have decided is necessary?
I'll tell you specifically.
South Africa?
South African variant. This is a very big concern for the scientists. The South African variant is worrying the experts because it may be that the vaccine doesn't respond in the same way, or doesn't work in quite the same way. And if that were the case, of course, it would be a tragedy to allow that into the country. So we need to do everything we possibly can to prevent it. And it's much more urgent and pressing than just the, if you like, coronavirus, the classic version, already here. 1 or 2 more cases doesn't change things dramatically. But the new variant, that could be a big game changer, and we don't want to see that, and that's why now.
OK, but lastly on this, and it's not your job to read the papers in the morning, it's mine. You may not be aware, but Kevin Peterson, the former England cricketer who is South African born, he's actually in the papers today saying that he's just come into the United Kingdom and he wasn't challenged. That's a problem, isn't it?
Well, I imagine can't have come in. I don't know the detail of this. I haven't seen the story, but we've grounded flights from South Africa.
But he probably came through a hub. I don't know.
Right, he would need to declare that and be aware that it would be a matter of law. Then I don't know whether there's a sports exemption that may apply. I don't know the specifics of the case, but there are no flights from South Africa, and I'm afraid actually just last night we've also taken I think 9 other South African countries and had to not just remove them from the travel corridor, but actually ban people from travelling from those locations, and you must declare where you've been. So it's very, very important that people understand that you can't come from those locations. If there is an exemption, it also involves a quarantine if you're, for example, a returning national from those locations.
Lastly, as you rightly said, it is the vaccination that will get us out of this hell, whether it's domestically or overseas. Bit embarrassing for your senior colleague Matt Hancock when he went to a clinic yesterday in North London. You may or might not be aware. He was hoping to see them administer the vaccine. It sadly had not arrived. Is this going to speak to the problems? You talk of hundreds of thousands next week. How confident are you? We couldn't get about 40 up to a clinic in North London yesterday.
Yeah, look, I hadn't seen that story. If you are distributing, as I say, more vaccinations than every other country in Europe put together and getting them into people's arms, and that's what we've already done, not what we're talking about doing, it's already happening, 1.5 million so far, then I've no doubt along the road there'll be a few bumps and logistics issues. But I have to say, calling in the army, I think, is a very smart move. I brought the army in a couple of weeks ago when we had that Kent lorry crisis caused by the French closing the border in Calais, and the army got that sorted out in pretty short order. We're calling in the army to help distribute this, along with our brilliant NHS workers. I've no doubt at all we will be rolling out hundreds of thousands a day of these 2 different vaccines, and let's get everybody vaccinated as quickly as possible. By the middle of February, we will have 88% of the categories of people who've been most dying from coronavirus, of those age groups and vulnerabilities, injected, if everything goes well.
Your credit to the military is absolutely right, last Secretary of State, because when you consider they built the Nightingale hospitals, as you rightly said, they helped with the Kent lorry drivers, they helped with the floods as well, they're now delivering the vaccines. In a way, perhaps they should be running the country.
Well, I tell you what, they've had quite a big...
Do you guys fancy a few months off and we'll let the military take over? What would you say?
Yeah. I think it's called a dictatorship, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part of it, yes.
I have to tell you, they had a £4 billion boost to their budget, the biggest uplift in decades. And they are absolutely fantastic in these kind of civil emergencies. They're brilliant, as well as defending us. And we're very lucky to have them. And I've seen it firsthand with things like that Kent lorry crisis a couple of weeks ago. And I know that they'll perform as well with the rollout of this mass vaccination of the nation, as I say, at a much faster pace than is happening elsewhere.
Thanks for your time this morning. Secretary of State for Transport Grant Shapps appearing here on LBC, where the time is 8 o'clock and news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Donald Trump is now committing to an orderly transition of power to